Welcome to What's Your Signal, the podcast exploring how organizations are securely connecting people, places, and things. You're joined by me, Taylor Walker, and my co-host, Mauricio Stefan. Hey, Mauricio.
Hi, Taylor. How's it going?
Oh, good. So, Mauricio, you've worked in the tech industry for a while, so I know you can empathize with this. Have you noticed that no matter where you work, all the industries seem to have its own lexicon that takes like forever to get up to speed on?
Yeah. It reminds me of like a scene in a movie, and I can't remember the movie, but the scene strikes me, right? And it's like the approved language, like they have an entire document. It was the improved language of the company. But yeah, I mean, even here at Cradlepoint, right, we have our own jargon that we use that's specific to Cradlepoint. And then even bigger in the 5G or the cellular industry, it has its own jargon separate from traditional networking industries. And it's funny. I think we talked about in some of our PCN podcasts how as when we're trying to extend private cellular into enterprise IT, trying to relate those common topics that have different verbiage between something like private cellular and Wi-Fi. So even, things that are the same depending on the industry or the vertical or the technology has different meanings. Even as you in the same industry, as you enhance the technology, like I'll just throw out one for our listeners who maybe can Google, and if they are that interested, right? In LTE, we had things called APNs, and 5G they're DNNs. So it's just as technology grows, we have to have new terms for things that are similar from the previous version.
I will say I was in the military for a while, and nothing has come close to how complicated their lexicon is for me. But in the tech industry, one that's definitely popped up over the last couple of years is SASE, which I erroneously called SASE for way too long until I finally heard it said out loud. And frankly, to this day, I still laugh a little bit when I hear someone very serious talking about SASE. But I think there's still a lot of mystery around SASE and what it is and its value for enterprise businesses. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. So the value of SASE goes beyond CISO cocktail hour fodder, and different aspects of SASE, particularly the elements of security, mean different things to different enterprises. And we've got two great guests here to help us understand how. Ted Harrington is an executive partner of Independent Security Evaluators, the co-founder of Start Vendor Risk Management and IoT Village, and an author of the #1 Amazon bestseller, Hackable. Joining Ted from Cradlepoint, we welcome back Security Product Marketing Manager, Bruce Johnson. So let's start with a lay of the land. Security is the first thing on any technology leader's minds these days, and that's because they're constantly bombarded by threats and the threat of threats and onward and onward. So what are some of the threats that organizations need to be wary of these days? Ted, let's start with you.
I like the way you frame that question, the threat of threats. That is, in fact, it's funny how in the security world, the sort of overused phrase is like, oh, what keeps you up at night? And I don't think anyone really likes asking or answering that question. But the way you described it, I thought was really interesting, the threat of threats, like being concerned that something bad might happen and how do we deal with that? And I think that itself even is the heart of the question, the first question you asked, right? What are organizations, what are the big things that they're thinking about? And one of the things that has definitely evolved and adapted that's pretty cool to see is that people have started to realize that there's no longer the external attacker and the internal attacker. It's like the perimeter doesn't exist anymore. Organizations used to think that a company, built its own corporate network, and now the good guys on the inside, the bad guys on the outside. And certainly the pandemic and work from home showed that not to be true. So that's one of the good things that has happened as people have realized that's always been the case, that the external attacker has been able to find a way to get inside, but now people are realizing how significant that is. And I'm excited about that.
Yeah. The traditional, the thing that keeps me up at night, this is a dad joke, insomnia. So,
and we're done, folks. That's it. We can't top that.
Yeah. As far as threats go, there's in many ways the landscape has changed. In some ways, it hasn't changed. So the thing that hasn't changed is that the threats are there all the time. They're not going away. And a lot of the ones that we've been hearing about for years are still some of our biggest threats. Phishing, ransomware, they're still with us. And because of that, I think we need to take a little bit of a pause and figure out, hey, is our current security model really working? Do we need to take a fresh look at it?
Yeah, and I would imagine that I'll just go back to that threat of threats mentality. It's kind of like a little bit of a Chicken Little mentality, which is exhausting, right? You're constantly thinking what could be around the next corner, what could be happening. And I think as a result, a lot of organizations these days want to automate things so that they maybe have to think about it less. But that security isn't always cheap. It's not always fast. It's not necessarily simple. Do you guys feel like today's security tactics are working?
When they're done right, yes, I think they're working.
Yeah.
But
Good tools
there's a
out.
big asterisk to that. Is I think that actually where most organizations are stumbling is that they're not doing things right. And I think even the way you were just describing it, I thought was really interesting, because I think that most people would just wish they didn't have to deal with security, right? They're like, can this just not be a problem? And that is what leads to this really, really big problem, which is this emphasis and reliance on automation that you're bringing up. Automation is really, really good, but we can't rely solely on automation. Like, there's a lot of things that we discover, attack scenarios, where an attacker will be able to combine two things, right? So they might, a good example is a project worked on recently where this system had a flaw called information leakage. And that meant that the system gives up information that it shouldn't. And in this case, it was giving up the user identifier. On its own, that's not really a problem. You don't want it to happen, but it's not even directly exploitable. We discovered a second issue with the system, which was where the authorization was broken. And so what we mean by that is authorization is when a system verifies, is an individual allowed to do a certain thing. And when we say it's broken, it means it doesn't work correctly. And so we've all experienced the process where when you want to change a password, they verify permissions by you have to supply the current password. So that's authorization. And the way that this system worked is it did require you to provide information, but it didn't require you to provide the password in order to change the password. What it required you to provide was the user identifier. Now, on its own, ostensibly, every person only knows their own user identifier, so that's not directly exploitable either. But when you combine those two problems, that means that an attacker could get every single user identifier for every user in the system, and then use that information to change the credentials for every user in the system, and thus take over the entire system, every single account, including the admin accounts. And that's a really great example of where, I mean, not only is it kind of cool to explain exploit chaining, but it's a great example of how we have to think about security, that it's not easy, it's not fast, it's not cheap. We can't automate it. There is no tool on earth that exists that could have figured out how to combine those two issues. You need a human being who thinks the way an attacker thinks in order to look at it and say, how could I combine multiple issues to arrive at an adverse outcome?
Yeah. And I think one of the other issues that we're seeing, and Ted, tell me your thoughts on this, but so many of the technologies that we're using rely on detection. And detection, to me, it seems it's only as good as your latest, antivirus signatures or your IDS IPS signatures. If you're solely relying on detection, then we're leaving ourselves open because of all the zero-day attacks coming out. What are your thoughts on that?
Yep, that's definitely true. I mean, a tool can only look for things that are known. So by definition, the new emerging threats, O-days, all that stuff, it's not going to work. And you can think about this I really like to look outside of security to try to illustrate concepts. And so if we think about literally any innovation that's ever happened anywhere in human history, that thing, it was not considered to be a thing that existed until we realized it did exist. And there's this theory called Black Swan theory, this idea that for basically all of human existence, there was the assumption that swans were white. They were only ever white. And people assumed it never could be anything other than white. And then in whatever year it was, like the 1700s or something, someone discovered a swan that was black. And that swan had existed all along, just no one knew about it. And so that's why we constantly have to be thinking about this like black swan theory, right? What is the thing that we assume doesn't exist or can't be true? What is true? And that's one of the things I think that is really cool when I think about the way that ethical hackers approach problems is they first identify assumptions that are made about how will a user interact with the system? How's the system built? What's the system supposed to do? And then they'll challenge those assumptions. A common assumption that people make that's wrong is things like they'll assume that a user will or will not do a certain thing with certain parts of a system. For example, a login field. Developers often assume that what goes in the login field will be the credentials, the password, and the username. But attackers will, not just attackers, but any type of hacker, ethical hackers or attackers will look at a system and say, well, what if I put in a command? What if I put in like 1,000 characters? What if I put in no characters? What happens then? And that's the process of challenging these assumptions. That's how you find those black swans.
Yeah, good point. Good point. You know, another common hacker technique that we've been seeing happen quite often is using IP scanning to kind of get pictures of the IP addressing structure. So thoughts on that, Ted? Anything you're seeing there with your ethical hacking practices?
Yeah, that would probably fall into reconnaissance, right? The idea of an attacker from an unprivileged vantage point wanting to understand what is it that they're even going to attack. And so that is information that they're going to want to understand. An example might be like I think castles are always a really good metaphor to think about for security. And if you can imagine looking at a medieval castle and you want to know what are the guards' schedules. So you just sit out there and you watch and you see, oh, well, it looks like at noon there's a changing of the guard. And wouldn't you know it, there's like a 1 minute gap when one guard leaves and the other one arrives. So now you have information about how the system works that you can then use as you later develop your attack scenario for how you might attack that castle.
Yeah, good point. You know, and I heard an analogy. Picture in your mind, if you got a picture in front of you where you got a regular residential door, and in that residential door, there's numerous ways that I can breach it. Right, I might pick the lock, I might do a brute force attack and kick the door open. But the bottom line is, because I can see it, I can really, like you said with reconnaissance, because I can see that door, I can form an attack strategy. But for those of you who are Harry Potter fans, you'll remember platform 9 3/4. So platform 9 3/4, you couldn't see it, right? You had to know where it was in order to get on that train to go to Hogwarts. And so being able to use something like name-based routing or some way to obfuscate your IP addressing scheme gives you the opportunity to have that platform 9 3/4 where you can obscure the networking address structure and kind of thwart some of that reconnaissance that the hackers might do.
You both kind of mentioned, Ted, you mentioned a castle, Bruce, you mentioned a residential door. I do find it funny is like people think of network security and information security as this nebulous thing. But if you approach it the same way that you would approach the physical security of your building, it's easier to break those things down, right? Because it's the same kind of thing, right? It's like, the funny thing here at Cradlepoint, if you've ever been at our headquarters building, we don't label any of the floors. So you don't know, like our signs on the front, but you don't know which floors are actually belong to Cradlepoint. So if you wanted to attack Cradlepoint, you would first have to, make that observation. So what can we do to prevent that? Well, you can't ride the elevator unless you have a key fob. So you can't even begin to explore which floors belong to the company and that sort of thing. So I think, that analogy of network security, information security as similar to physical security is a good one. And approaching it the same way that you would approach the physical security of your building, I think is a good way to start as far as understanding information security or network security.
Yeah, good point.
I'm really glad that you tied it all together with that particular analogy because, Bruce, as you were talking about, Harry Potter. I have not thought about that particular metaphor yet, and it is now going in the repertoire. That was a cool
All right.
idea. But I wanted to push back on it until what Mauricio said. But I wanted to push back on it at first because there is a real problem with obfuscation, which is that obfuscation needs to be an additional layer, not the layer. And the problem with the 9 3/4 metaphor is if you did know that that was where to go, there was actually no access control.
Right.
You just go through it. Or I think. I'm not a Harry Potter fan, so I think that's the way that it worked in the movie. But I don't think they had to like authenticate in any way once they went through. So the point there is that secrecy alone is not what makes a system secure. Secrecy is a layer on top. And then the way that Mauricio is talking about the cradle point building, that connects the dots properly, which is, okay, there's secrecy, which is you don't know what's on each floor, but we're going to operate under the assumption that someone does know what's on each floor.
Yeah.
And so we're going to make sure that the elevator is badged. So you first have to get past the security guard in the lobby, then you have to have a badge to get on the elevator. Ideally, there's people on the elevator with you who are like, who are you? What are you doing on this floor? You look sketchy, that kind of stuff. And those
I
layers
get that all
are
the time.
what make it secure. Nice.
So one of the things that I want to start tying this into is SASE, and it being one of the security solutions that we can use to safeguard a network. And it incorporates some of these elements. Bruce, can you share an overview of what SASE is and kind of its significance in today's cybersecurity landscape?
Sure. So let me back up in time a little bit, give you a little bit of the history since we're talking about castles and Harry Potter and everything. Mm-hmm. So first of all, we talked about the castle. So back in the old days when we had the castle, we'd dig a big moat and we could protect that castle. So we knew what our boundaries were. We knew what the perimeters were. And so that kind of changed. Some of it changed with COVID. Some of it had already changed before COVID. And so the other thing that we see is that IT teams are shrinking, right? They're not getting bigger typically. They're getting smaller, especially the security teams. They just don't have the budget, or they can't find the people to have those security teams. So SASE framework is kind of an effort to streamline security, and by converging security with the networking into kind of one model. And then ideally it would be, one vendor that would be able to provide all of those services. And that one vendor would mean that hopefully you have a single management platform. So you can manage your security, you can manage your networking all from one platform. And now to address the other piece about the perimeter being gone, you got people that are working from all over the globe. So how do you protect those folks without them having to go back to corporate every time to get the security? Well, you have cloud delivered security. So that's if you want to boil SASE down, think of a circle. On one side of the circle, you've got your networking or SD-WAN, and on the other side, you have your security. So the security on one side, the networking on the other, those two pieces come together, hopefully also gets those departments within the companies working a little closer together, because in a lot of companies, they rarely even acknowledge each other. They're sometimes competitors for budget and other things, whereas they really should be working together. So SASE is hopefully a way that we can simplify and orchestrate all these things together in a more of a unified framework.
In the introduction, Taylor and I were talking about, different lexicon for different things. Bruce, what you talked about actually reminds me going back to my early learnings in networking. Like, isn't SASE just the CIA triad for security, right? The CIA triad is confidentiality, integrity, and availability, right? Availability is the networking, right? And so you're talking about like the SD-WAN and networking piece being the availability of the network, the availability to access information. And, Ted, you're talking about the security aspects, which is just the confidentiality, right? Securing the data, making sure you can only access the data. So, trying to just kind of relate a newer term for technology into something that's, I think, has been around for a while, which is just that CIA triad when it comes to security. Yep.
I remember them harping on that when I was doing my CISSP certification. So yeah, it's been around for a while, but I think it's still valid.
Ted, I'm curious on your take of, having all of these elements of SASE in one spot, in theory, provides a little bit of a more manageable security circle. I'm just like thinking of Bruce explaining it, especially for smaller IT teams. And I know that you've worked with a lot of companies of different sizes, and I'm curious what you think about the implications of that, about having a solution that a small IT team can use even in a large setting.
I think all security teams are small. So I don't know. Maybe we should say that about all companies. I mean, even the largest companies in the world.
You said when we talked the other day, you were working with one of the Fortune 10 companies and they had an extremely small security company.
Yeah, I mean, it's wild how small these security teams are and the amount of responsibility that's loaded onto them. And so I think we start from that, which is that even the large companies have small teams and the small companies have no teams. In some senses, the small companies wind up actually having more capabilities because they recognize they have to outsource it. And so it's just a practical necessity, right? If a company's doing 10, 50, $100 million in revenue and maybe they can't invest in more than even like 0 to 2 security people, they realize they're not going to get every capability they need. So they outsource it. And that gives them the capabilities they need. But a larger company has the resources to build teams with the capabilities. And they sometimes overestimate how difficult that can be to actually do it, like get all those capabilities all the time. And then they have the competing problems like Mauricio is alluding to, or different departments compete. You might have in one enterprise a staff security department that does a certain thing in one group, but not making their resources available to other groups. And so it's kind of a wild thing that happens. So I think I don't know if I answered your question other than adding color to the fact that the headcount problem is really significant.
Why do you think that is? If it's so if security is keeping people up at night, why don't we have bigger security teams? Is it like a training thing? Is it a budget thing?
I think it's because security is hard to measure. So if you haven't been hacked, does that mean that it's because you're doing it right? Or is it because you've just been lucky? And when you think about where decisions are made in an organization, they're made at executive levels. And there's some well-known cognitive biases that executives, myself included, have. Things like recency bias. It's like whatever happened recently, we put more weight to. And if recently have been hacked, you're like, I'm great at this. And so those types of things inform decisions. And then the maybe even bigger piece to it, more so than that, is it's really hard to correlate revenue and profit to security. And I hear people all day long making the case that like, well, if you get hacked, it's going to cost you $10 million and our product will save you $10 million because you won't get hacked. And it's like, that's so nonsense. Like there's no executive who's like, that sounds great. I'll do that. Like it doesn't even sound true. And so I think what we need to do in security is we need to better correlate outcomes that are measurable and associate those to either revenue or profit if we can. So like one of the arguments that I make when I was writing my book Hackable, I originally had 9 chapters in the book, and all those 9 chapters were about how do you actually build better, more secure systems? How do you work with penetration testers? How do you share information? How should you budget? But as I was thinking about it, as I was writing the book, I had to sit and reflect. And I thought about the companies who hire us for our services. And I had to think, I was like, why do they hire us? Now, of course, I wanted to have the noble, because security is important. Of course they're hiring. That's why they're doing it. And for all of them, it is important. They are willing to spend money to do it the right way. But I realized for most of them, there's an additional motivator, which is that they have figured out, like progressive companies have figured this out. They've figured out how to correlate security, their investments in security, as a competitive advantage. So they're able to go to their customers, like every company sells something to another company, and they're able to go to their customer and say, here's how we actually demonstrate our core values. We say we value the customer. We say we value quality. We say we value good partnership. Whatever their values are, most of them are echoed in your investment in security. And being able to convey that to your customer and say, and here's the proof. Here's a report that shows how rigorous we've been. We're not relying on these like nonsensical scans that don't actually deliver security. We're actually doing it the right way. You can correlate that as a marketing investment. You can say, hey, look, we've equipped our sales team with these talking points, and they were able to move through procurement X number of weeks faster because the procurement of the buyer was more confident to move forward with us. And that is a really powerful way to correlate.
Yeah. Hey, before we get away from that, like these smaller security teams and some of the challenges they have, I wanted to share one point here. And I found this really interesting. And this is probably for larger or mid-sized or larger companies, but this report says that this is a pretty recent report, that the average enterprise has 76 security tools. All right. And I don't think they're double counting if they have 5 firewalls. That doesn't count as 5 unless they're different types. But I think this brings home a point. 76 different tools, and they may not be all from different vendors. Although if they are from the same vendor, sometimes even the management platforms from the same vendor are different when they've tried to integrate acquisitions and so on. So I wanted to bring up this point just to point out that if you can get a solution like a SASE where you're bringing together multiple tools and networking into one, and you can manage it all from one place, then I think that goes a long ways towards addressing that shortage you have with the lean IT teams.
That number even sounds low. You said 76. I was like,
is that right? You think it's higher?
Did you mean 376? Yeah, I don't know. I don't have any data, but that seems low. And when you think about what does it take to operate even one of those tools, to respond to the alerts and notifications those tools give you, to be trained enough, if we're talking about enterprise class tools, right? Like, which we probably are, more sophisticated tools, that's a significant person power investment to run that.
I think the other thing is we've been focusing on IT, right? IT teams, security teams. The other aspect, to throw out another buzzword, right, is OT applications, right? Those applications that are sourced by other departments outside of IT for like marketing needs or marketing needs is usually the big ones. Like, I'm looking for a digital signage solution, or I'm looking for, some kind of solution to do something that's not necessarily sourced and managed by IT, which then become, not to call out my esteemed co-host or anything, but what does marketing know about managing security of an application that they sourced, right? That becomes a burden on the IT team to ensure that that's a secure application, and that they have the ability to monitor and manage, and that's not creating an issue in the network, right? My mind always goes back to, recency bias, like in the news, HVAC systems in a large retailer being hacked. That's an OT application. Fish tank management in a hotel entertainment facility becoming a point of entry into the network. That's an OT application that was likely sourced by maintenance. So, it's those kind of things where you don't think of them as attack vectors, or the people who are sourcing them don't necessarily have that even in their thought process as far as sourcing those types of applications.
Yeah, good point. That's a good point. I think that also underlines the reason why we need to have. I think one of the places that our customers can start is replacing some of their VPN systems that have a lot more default connectivity. Yeah, VPN is, yes, it's using encryption and that piece of it is secure, but once you're in, you're in. So when you got an OT system coming on board, if you can at least limit that blast radius by limiting that lateral movement with the zero trust system, I think that's going to go a long ways to getting them started.
Ted, I have a question for you in your hacker brain. If a company has, I've just been thinking about this stat that Bruce shared. I've just been sitting here thinking about it while the rest of you are talking. If a company has, let's say, 76 security tools, and they're all by different vendors, and then a different one has maybe this single vendor SASE solution that's consolidated a lot of tools into one spot. As a hacker, is it easier to, I guess, pull the wool over the eyes of an enterprise with a mixed bag of tools and a mixed bag of management systems because they have all these different ways to get in and all these different platforms that they could potentially outsmart? Or is it easier to, as a hacker, to understand this one consolidated tool really, really well and then get in? Does that make sense? What I'm asking?
Is the question making the assumption that an attacker has the same level of access to those tools as the company does?
Sure.
I think Taylor's question is like, is the fact that there are so many tools doing potentially different things, potentially overlapping things, is that a concern? Does that create a security concern in itself that you have to look at, say, like a SIEM tool in order to aggregate logs together, and look at an IDS tool to see if you have any kind of intrusion coming into the network, and look at a different content filtering tool to see if people are accessing malicious sites, and a different antivirus tool to look at something else? I think Taylor's question is along the lines of, if they have so many tools, is there potential that there's an exploit because there may be a gap in the tools, or the fact that you have to pivot from, what we call swivel chair, right, from screen to screen to try and get the full view of what's going on in the network? Does that create an issue in itself?
Yeah, if you have all these security tools from different vendors, are you more at risk than if you just have maybe a consolidated tool?
I see. No. Well, let me answer it this way. So, having multiple tools doesn't introduce a new vulnerability. Managing the tools and maybe the false confidence that might come with that's where there's potentially a problem. Certainly dealing with the overwhelming degree of notifications that you might have, all that stuff, that's going to be really hard, especially for a small team to deal with. But having multiple tools, it's not like because you went from 5 tools to 10 tools, all of a sudden that introduces a security vulnerability. It might expose a deficiency in your ability to handle those tools and actually do something with them. I mean, there's so much waste. Like we've had customers in the past where they'll ask us for, we don't usually recommend, we certainly don't endorse or resell any tools, but occasionally they'll ask for our opinion. They'll about a category. They'll be like, we think we're going to deploy this type of tool. What do you think? And there was a customer recently who asked us that question, and we said, well, don't you already have this other tool? Because I think that delivers that same capability. And they didn't actually realize that the tool they were already paying for, and it was like, $200,000 a year tool, did the thing that they were about to spend another $100,000 on per year. And it's like, I wanted to say, can we get some of that to be going into more hacking projects? Because you need those.
Yeah. And are you actually using that other product that you didn't even know you had? Because that's, I think what it comes down to is the most effective tools are the ones that you're actually using. We had a customer one time that had bought an IDS IPS appliance back in the day, and we went by to visit them, and this is a month or two after they bought it, and it was sitting there unplugged on the in the office, and we say, hey, what's up with that? This is there was just too many alerts kept coming in, and we just couldn't keep up with it, so we just unplugged it. So
Yep.
they were using it, so it's not effective. It's not going to help them.
I believe it.
So Bruce, you mentioned zero trust as far as lateral movement, and the one thing that we've talked a lot about tools, and we've talked a lot about systems. The one thing that I do want to bring up that I think a SASE solution helps with is just people, right? People are, and I'll speak for myself. I don't want to speak for anybody else on the call or any of our listeners. I recently had an issue where I received an email from Spotify that someone logged into my Spotify account from Belarus. And being a person who is very security conscious but lazy, had used the same password across a lot of different things. And so obviously if someone was able to get access to my Spotify account, figuring out what my email and password were, they could now use that combination in a whole bunch of different things. So I had to spend 4 hours going from app to app to app to app, changing my password. I bring this up because I think that there's no amount of tools and no amount of automation that will overcome my inherent laziness and will reuse passwords across multiple systems. And so can we talk a little bit about what is out there that is part of SASE, because I brought up Zero Trust, that will help alleviate those things?
Mauricio, really quick, I think it would help illustrate your story better if you tell us what the passwords were.
Yeah. No, don't say anything.
There is actually, not to upend the question, but there is a tool that would actually make the exact scenario you just described easier, and that is a password manager. Because when you use a password manager, you can now put long, complex, and most importantly, unique passwords for each individual service in the password manager. And then you won't have to remember anything other than your master password. And you won't have that problem where when one site gets popped, all the rest of them are inherently popped. And then if you're worried about the password managers themselves, which I am, we've done research showing that you can actually extract secrets from even a locked password manager. But I still use one. And there's ways that you can use them to have, there's a technique where you use a modifier that enable it so that once the password manager gets popped, which it will eventually, it's not like they get all the passwords. So the combination of those two things actually makes that very, very easy.
Yeah, it's good point.
Yeah, I think also, one of the things, that's a good point, Tate, because I do use a password manager. In fact, I've used a couple. I switched recently because I used one that was in the news. We won't name names, but was in the news recently as not being as secure. So I switched from that one to a new one. But I kind of want to go back to the zero trust topic, Bruce, on this too, right? Because even if a user's password gets popped, the concept of zero trust helps prevent, like if I get compromised in the Cradlepoint network and they're able to get my credentials, I have limits on what I'm allowed to access. And so it does prevent them from being able to exploit that to get access to everything, right?
Yeah, let me tell you a little story to kind of illustrate what we mean by zero trust. I checked into a hotel a couple of months ago, and they gave me my key card. It was a high-rise hotel. I think it was about 60 stories. And so I had to get in the elevator, and I had to scan my card before I could press a button. And that's pretty standard. You guys have done this before. But what I found is that I could actually press any button once I had scanned my card. All right. So the security was, you got to have the card to be able to get in, but it actually lets me go anywhere I want once I have that key card and I scan it. That's kind of like traditional VPN technology, where yes, you've got encrypted connection, and you got to validate to get in that first time. But once you're in, it's a lot easier to move laterally. And you talked about our headquarters elevator in Boise, how you cannot get to a floor unless you're explicitly authorized by policy on your key card. So your employee badge, you scan that employee badge, but it doesn't work. It does not work like it did in that hotel. I can only press the buttons that I'm authorized to go to. And that allows you to have a little bit more protection against that blast radius. So even if somebody does break in, they can't get very far because they don't have that visibility. And we have the no default connections are defined there. It's trust no one by default.
Yep. Trust should be earned. And I think I like that hotel metaphor. That's interesting. The way I've thought about,
you going to put it in your book, Ted?
What's that?
Are you going to put it in your book?
Maybe. I'll have to noodle on that one.
Bruce is looking for royalties.
Yeah. I think the way I've always thought about zero trust, the metaphor is like when we think about what happened during the COVID pandemic, and zero trust would be assuming that every other person has COVID. And until you determine that they do not have COVID, you operate under that assumption. So that was such a weird time in America because it became a political issue and not a public health crisis. But if we actually treated it like a public health crisis and not a right versus left debate, we would do things like assume everyone else was sick. And then from there, we would do things like, oh, well, now masking in certain situations makes sense. In other situations, it doesn't make sense. Keeping distance makes sense until you find out that this person, definitively does not have it. And that was what public health officials were trying to articulate. And I think maybe we failed as a nation at that. But that's really what zero trust is about. Like, everyone around me is sick until I know that they are not sick, as opposed to, well, I just don't want to because I don't like this or I don't like that.
If you're a parent of a toddler, you still do that. You just assume every other kid is sick and your kid is not allowed around them until you can prove that they are not sick. Well, Ted and Bruce, I want to thank you for joining us today to unravel some of these complexities of network security and SASE and really dive into the changing needs of organizations and how folks can approach that. Ted, before we go, where can our listeners find more information about you and your book and the other great work that you're doing?
Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find. Just go to tedharrington.com, and information on my book is there, on the hacking stuff that we do. I'm coming out with a new book pretty soon. Information about that is there as well. Where you can find me on social media, it's all there. Just tedharrington.com.
Easy. Well, thanks so much for joining us, guys. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Have a great day.
Mauricio, that was a good chat about security and some SASE and some hacker things. And one thing that Ted said that I really liked was that security is a competitive advantage. And I think that talk track for me resonated because sometimes it is difficult to explain why security is important other than you have important things that other people shouldn't have. But that competitive advantage piece made a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, right? Is like, would you rather do business with a company that takes protecting your data? Because, I mean, regardless of if you're a consumer or a business, you are handing over valuable information about yourself or your business to people that you do business with. So would you rather do business with somebody who's going to take protecting that seriously, or someone who has been in the news because obviously they can't be trusted with that type of data? So the other thing that kind of resonated with me that Ted mentioned was the black swan theory, right? Is like, you don't know what you don't know until you do. And so you have to think about those things, like really think about it. Like, I think the injection attack that he mentioned, right, is where you have a password field, and as a developer that created that password field, you just assume that everybody's only ever going to put a password in there, so you don't protect it against anything else. Well, hackers don't assume that I can only put a password in there. They're going to test the limits of what I can put in there. So it's one of those things where it's like, just don't assume that the thing you're using is only ever going to be used for that. Think about, if I wanted something in your house, how would I get it? If I wanted it without having to ask you for it, or maybe even if I ask you for it, in the case of phishing or spear phishing or those social engineering attacks, I may just ask you for it and see if you give it to me. But how else would I go about getting it? And so what are those, defense in depth things that you need to do to protect that?
Well, all thanks for tuning in today. If you enjoyed today's chat with our industry experts, please be sure to rate and subscribe to What's Your Signal wherever you listen to podcasts. Visit cradlepoint.com to learn more.